continuing on with the theme of Clara's talk, I'm going to talk about how Du Châtelet is neither Leibnizian nor Wolffian. And though I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, and some of the terminology in my talk is just terminology I have introduced, though it does map somewhat with terms that are already in use, especially in like discussions of idealism. So the thesis for the talk, it's on the handout, is that unlike her predecessors, Leibniz and Wolff, Du Châtelet is committed to what I'm going to call causal epistemic idealism about natural causes. And I got the wording switched on the handout. It should be causal, it should be epistemic causal idealism, not causal epistemic. Okay, about natural causes. And again, a natural cause is just a worldly cause. And the contrast I have in mind here is just with a divine cause. So the thought is that Du Châtelet is committed to epistemic causal idealism about natural or worldly causes. So what I'm going to do first is just talk about what I mean by this label. I'll distinguish two different kinds of causal idealisms, and then I'll talk a bit about Leibniz, just really to show how Du Châtelet is so unlike Leibniz actually on this, and then I'll give the argument for why Du Châtelet, I think, is committed, or there's a good case for thinking that Du Châtelet is committed to epistemic causal idealism. Okay, so let us then say that causal idealism is the view on which there is a constitutive connection between causal relations in the world and our finite human minds. Okay, so there's somehow the strong constitutive connection. Now, understood in this way, causal idealism requires more than a mere modal connection between causal relations in our worlds and our minds. So it's not enough for a constitutive connection that, that necessarily, for example, if something is a cause, then it is accessible to the mind. That is merely a modal connection. So a constitutive connection is something stronger than that. And why does causal idealism require the stronger thing? Well, because the modal connection in question, suppose there was just a modal connection, it may be explained by something other than that it is constitutive of causation, that it is intelligible. So consider, for example, the view on which the world has been created for us, such that God as creator has made it the case that all causes can be known by us. Now, such a view does not qualify as idealist, for it is not the case that it is constitutive of causes that they be intelligible. Right? It is God who directly guarantees that all causes are intelligible. God has just created the world such that, everything lines up. Our minds line up with how the world is. You might think in a similar vein, Descartes argues, for example, that our knowledge of the external world depends on God's not being a deceiver. So you might think that, something like God can be an explanation. It can explain why my knowledge or why my beliefs about, say, external objects in Descartes' case seem to just line up with how the world is, right? So that there is this modal connection between what's in my mind and what's out there does not entail any kind of idealism, right? A mere modal connection is not enough. Okay. So again, causal idealism is the view on which there's this constitutive connection between causal relations in the world and our human mind. And now let us just distinguish two varieties of causal idealism. And I'm calling these metaphysical and epistemic. Okay, so metaphysical causal idealism is the view on which causation is merely a projection of human mind. And on this sort of view, it's going to be a consequence of what a cause is constitutively, namely a projection of the human mind, that it is knowable by us. Okay. An example of someone who's arguably a metaphysical causal idealist is Hume. Okay, so on Hume's view, at least on some interpretations of Hume, Helen Beebe's, for example, Hume qualifies as a causal idealist of this variety. Okay, now let us contrast that with what I'm calling epistemic causal idealism. And on this view, it is constitutive of what a cause is, that it is knowable by us. And again, by us, I mean finite human minds. Okay, and the claim again is going to be that Du Châtelet is an epistemic causal idealist. Metaphysical and epistemic causal idealism are distinct from, though related to, Berkeleyan idealism on the one hand and Kantian idealism on the other hand. So Berkeleyan idealism, according to Berkeleyan idealism, objects depend for their existence on mental acts of perception, just as on metaphysical causal idealism, causal relations depend for their existence on the mind. Okay, so there's a parallel between Hume's view here and Berkeley's view. And by contrast, according to Kantian idealism, objects or appearances are not experience transcendent. This is a term that I'm borrowing from Lucy Lace. If an object exists, then it is possible for us to experience it. So objects are just possible objects of experience. And likewise, in parallel with that view, my claim is that for Du Châtelet, if a cause exists in the natural world, then it is possible for us to grasp it. Or in other words, natural causes just are possible objects of understanding for us. Okay, so Du Châtelet, you might think, rejects what we might call understanding transcendence for natural causes. Natural causes do not transcend our understanding. And that is just what it is to be an epistemic causal idealist. Okay. There are interesting parallels with Kant here that I'm happy to talk about later. Though I'm not gonna call Du Châtelet Kantian because that's wrong and it's anachronistic. Yeah, and I mean, perhaps Kant was influenced by Du Châtelet, though I haven't found concrete evidence of that. Okay. So what makes Du Châtelet an epistemic causal idealist? I'm going to argue that her commitment to this position stems from three distinct views that she has. So first, like Leibniz and Wolff, she holds that sufficient reasons are reasons that are intelligible. But instead of stopping at this general intelligibility constraint, she goes further. She restricts the class of relevant agents to us finite human beings. Okay. Oh, and I should have said that, Jaren has been doing some really interesting work on like Du Châtelet and intelligibility, and there are lots of points of agreement as well as disagreement that I'll point out as we go on. And I'd be very happy to discuss more. Okay, so second, Du Châtelet holds that a cause is good only insofar as it satisfies the principle of sufficient reason. So she endorses this tight connection between causes and sufficient reasons. So she says this, that a cause is good only insofar as it satisfies the principle of sufficient reason in section 10. And it suggests that, all causes for her are sufficient reasons. I mean, at least there is something like a tight connection there. And then third, I'm going to show that unlike Leibniz, Du Châtelet's commitment to an epistemic constraint on sufficient reason is generated by the theoretical role that the PSR plays for her in her system, namely that of providing a foundation for knowledge, and as well as the argument that she puts forward for the PSR. And absent any other explanation for why there is this modal connection for her between sufficient reasons and their intelligibility for us, I'm going to argue that we should take an intelligibility constraint on sufficient reasons and thereby causes to be constitutive of what a cause is for Du Châtelet. Okay, so that's going to be the rough outline. Okay, so I'm going to start again by talking about Leibniz, in part because, by her own description, Du Châtelet says, in the preface that she is expounding, Leibniz's metaphysics, and Leibniz does endorse this epistemic constraint on sufficient reason. And so I'll begin by talking about the shape of that and how it actually is quite distinct from the epistemic constraint that Du Châtelet endorses on sufficient reason and also causes. Okay, so Leibniz, now Leibniz formulates the PSR in several distinct ways as the claim that nothing happens without reason, that nothing happens without a cause, that every fact or true assertion has a sufficient reason for why it is thus and not otherwise, that nothing happens without a sufficient reason that determines why it is so and not otherwise, that a reason must be given for every truth, and as the claim that every truth has an a priori proof. Now, these formulations differ in what they take to be the ontological category of the explanandum. Some take it to be an event, others take it to be a fact or truth. They also differ in what they take to be the ontological category of the explanans. Some formulations take it to be a cause, others take it to be a reason, and at least one takes it to be an a priori proof. And finally, the different logical forms. Some of these formulations are contrastive, others are not. Now, there might be a temptation here to treat all these formulations as distinct principles of sufficient reason. But there's at least one passage that dates from 1686, roughly, that seems to suggest that we should treat them as versions of the same principle. And yeah, this passage is on the handout, where Leibniz writes that there are two first principles of all reasonings: the principle of contradiction and the principle that a reason must be given. That is, that every true proposition which is not known per se has an a priori proof, or that a reason can be given for every truth, or as is commonly said, that nothing happens without a cause. Now here, Leibniz seems to run together three seemingly different kinds of exponents, having an a priori proof, having a reason, and having a cause. Yet arguably, these are not distinct conceptions. And in particular, the notion of an a priori proof, as Leibniz uses it here, in fact, has a pre-Kantian meaning, where an a priori proof is just a proof from the cause. And, as we'll see, as I'm going to argue, it is Leibniz's commitment to this conception of sufficient reason as an a priori proof, which is crucial to his view that sufficient reasons for most propositions, and arguably all contingent propositions, are in principle unknowable for us, despite the fact that there's this epistemic constraint on what qualifies as a sufficient reason. And I have a few passages on the handout where Leibniz seems to endorse this view that a class of sufficient reasons are just beyond our grasp. Okay, so here, this first passage is from the Monadology. And he writes, the principle by virtue of which we consider that we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it is thus and not otherwise, although most of the time these reasons cannot be known by us. And then again in the second passage, from on contingency, every true or universal affirmative proposition, either necessary or contingent, has some connection between subject and predicate. In identities, this connection is self-evident. In other propositions, it must appear through the analysis of terms. And with this secret, the distinction between necessary and contingent truths is revealed, something not easily understood unless one has some acquaintance with mathematics. In necessary propositions, when the analysis is continued indefinitely, it arrives at an equation that is an identity. But in contingent propositions, one continues the analysis to infinity through reasons for reasons, so that one never has a complete demonstration, though there's always underneath a reason for the truth. But the reason is understood completely only by God, who alone traverses the infinite series in one stroke of mind. And that, I think, suggests that sufficient reasons, where a sufficient reason, again, is an a priori demonstration, for contingent truths are such that only God can completely grasp them. And again, the reason here seems to be that because the demonstration here would be infinitely long and our minds are finite. And then finally, we have this passage from the Discourse on Metaphysics, where Leibniz says, when we consider carefully the connection of things, we can say that from all time in Alexander's soul, there are vestiges of everything that has happened to him and marks of everything that will happen to him, and even traces of everything that happens in the universe, even though God alone could recognize them all. And again, I want to draw attention to the modal language here. So Leibniz isn't saying that, as a matter of fact, God alone recognizes them all, but that only God could. And again, the explanation here seems to be that so the sufficient reasons for contingent propositions are going to be infinitely long. And as human beings with finite minds, we could not grasp an infinite demonstration. And so even though everything has a sufficient reason, where the sufficient reason again, the sufficient reason here, like in connection with Leibniz's concept containment theory of truth, is going to consist in a predicate, being included in the subject of a proposition. That demonstration that shows that a predicate is included in the subject is going to be infinitely long for contingent propositions, and and this is why, that sufficient reasons for contingent truths are just beyond our grasp. Though they're not unintelligible, because an intelligent being could grasp them, namely God. Okay. So that is just, so I'm using Leibniz as a foil here because I think Du Châtelet is very much not committed to this view. A sufficient reason for her is something that is understandable by us. All sufficient reasons are such that they're understandable by us in principle. Okay. Does Leibniz's rejection of epistemic idealism about sufficient reason? Okay, so I take Leibniz to be rejecting epistemic idealism about sufficient reason, in that, he doesn't think that it's a constraint by a finite human mind. So does this rejection extend to his rejection of causal epistemic idealism? I think there's some reason to think that it does. For Leibniz's rejection of epistemic idealism about sufficient reason to extend to his rejection of causal epistemic idealism, or epistemic causal idealism, at least some sufficient reasons for contingent truths must be natural and efficient causes. And there's reason to think that, at least some sufficient reasons for contingent truths are natural and efficient causes. So in an early argument for the PSR, written between 1671 and 1672, Leibniz endorses the view that a sufficient reason for the existence of a thing consists in all its requisites for existence. Yes, I'm not going to rehearse the argument, but this is an early argument for the PSR, and various philosophers, including Adams, have argued that there are lots of problems with it, but it's an argument that Leibniz seems to endorse much later in his career as well, and it comes up in his correspondence with Clarke. But the crucial thing about this argument is that a sufficient reason is defined as all the requisites, or I'm going to say the totality of requisites. Now, any one requisite that belongs to all the requisites thus constitutes a partial sufficient reasons. And a requisite here is, for Leibniz, an explanatorily prior necessary condition. And while some of these requisites are essential and defining properties of an entity, other requisites are causes. And indeed, all efficient causes for Leibniz seem to constitute either partial or complete sufficient reasons. So he writes, for example, that a cause is a requisite according to that mode by which the thing is produced. Okay. So, and that suggests that Leibniz's rejection of epistemic idealism about sufficient reason extends to his rejection of epistemic idealism about causes as well. Okay, because efficient causes for Leibniz, at least partially, seem to constitute sufficient reasons. Also, as we saw earlier, Leibniz often formulates the PSR in causal terms, and his account of a sufficient reason in terms of an a priori proof appeals to a from the cause notion of the a priori, which suggests that an a priori proof consists in a causal explanatory series. If all sufficient reasons for Leibniz are also causal reasons, or perhaps more precisely backed by causal relations, then Leibniz's epistemic idealism about sufficient reasons straightforwardly entails causal epistemic idealism. Okay, but I'm not going to make a full case for that second claim here, because it's not really required for the point that I'm making. So all we really need is that, look, is a claim that Leibniz is not an epistemic causal idealist, because he's not an epistemic. He's not an epistemic idealist about sufficient reasons. Okay. Before I move on to Du Châtelet, I just want to address one wrinkle here in Leibniz, in how I'm reading Leibniz. So here's the question: is the claim that not all sufficient reasons can be drawn by us, can be known by us, in tension with Leibniz's claim that in the new essays that it must generally be possible to conceive how a quality of a substance arises from its nature? Because again, Leibniz does seem to have this commitment to the intelligibility of sufficient reasons, and this comes up really clearly in the new essays. Rutherford, in his 1992 paper, has argued, for example, that in addition to the PSR, Leibniz is also committed to this more restrictive principle, one that Rutherford calls his principle of intelligibility. Okay, and so I've given you a couple of passages on the handout here from the new essays. So the first reads, whenever we find some quality in a subject, we ought to believe that if we understood the nature of both the subject and the quality, we would conceive how the quality could arise from it. So within the order of nature, miracles apart, it is not at God's arbitrary discretion to attach this or that quality haphazardly to substances. He will never give them any that are not natural to them, that is, that cannot arise from their nature as explicable modifications. Now, so there's an exception here for miracles, because miraculous qualities or features do not arise from a substance's nature. They are attached directly by God. But even if we restrict ourselves to the non-miraculous qualities or features, I think that this passage does not obviously support the claim that on Leibniz's view, it must be possible, with the exception of miracles, for us to conceive how a property of a substance arises from its nature. That is, to conceive its explanatory ground or sufficient reason. And that is because Leibniz's claim seems to be that if we understood the nature of both the subject and the quality, we would conceive how the quality could arise from the subject. Okay, it's a conditional claim. And this conditional claim falls short of an assertion that in every non-miraculous case, we can conceive how a given property arises from the nature of the subject that instantiates it. Also, it is not obvious from this passage that being able to conceive how a quality arises from the nature of the subject is equivalent to being able to know the sufficient reason for why the quality is instantiated by the subject. So the bar for knowing a sufficient reason is arguably stronger. And for Leibniz, it seems to require knowledge of a finite or infinitely long demonstration that reduces the proposition to an identity, because that's what a sufficient reason is. Yet earlier in this same discussion, Leibniz seems to suggest that everything that is within the natural order can be grasped by some creature or other. And so he writes, I acknowledge that we must not deny what we do not understand, but I add that we are entitled to deny, within the natural order at least, whatever is absolutely unintelligible and inexplicable. I also maintain that substances, material or immaterial, cannot be conceived in their bare essence devoid of activity, that activity is of the essence of substance in general. And finally, that although what creatures conceive is not the measure of God's powers, their conceptivity or power of conceiving is the measure of nature's powers. Everything which is in accord with the natural order can be conceived or understood by some creature. Bless you. So again, Leibniz's modal claim here that everything that is in the natural order can be conceived or understood by some creature appears to be in tension with his claim that most sufficient reasons are unknown to us. If everything which is in accord with the natural order includes sufficient reasons for contingent truth. But again, Leibniz's modal claim here can be understood as the claim that we would be in a position to grasp how a quality that belonged to a subject could arise from its nature if we understood the nature of both the subject and the quality. Okay, so I don't actually think, again, the upshot is that I don't think there's a tension here within Leibniz. The epistemic, intelligibility constraint that Leibniz endorses on sufficient reason can be made compatible with his claims that sufficient reasons are beyond our grasp. That is, sufficient reasons for contingent truths are beyond the grasp of finite human mind. I have lots of things to say about everything I just said. But okay, turning then to Du Châtelet and Du Châtelet's departure from Leibniz and Wolff in brackets. Okay, so Du Châtelet, like Leibniz and like Wolff, as I'll discuss in a second, also endorses an epistemic constraint on sufficient reason. And again, by an epistemic constraint, there's this condition on sufficient reason for her that it be graspable or understandable by us. And I've quoted a couple of passages here, from sections 8 and 9. So she writes, now a thing cannot come to exist without a sufficient reason by which an intelligent being might understand why this thing becomes actual, having been possible before. Thus, a cause must contain not only the principle of the actuality of the thing of which it is the cause, but also the sufficient reason for this thing. That is to say, what makes it possible for an intelligent being to understand why this thing exists. Okay, that's the epistemic constraint. If he does not see this reason, as often happens when things are too complicated, he must at least be certain that one could not demonstrate that the thing in question cannot have sufficient reason for its existence. Thus, in all that exists, there must be something making it possible to understand why something that exists could exist. This is what is called sufficient reason. Okay, a reason that makes it possible to understand why something that exists could exist. And then again, in an earlier passage, he writes, when asking someone to account for his actions, we persist with our own questions until we obtain a reason that satisfies us. Again, interesting. Yeah, I haven't found a phrasing like this in Leibniz, where sufficient reason is characterized as a reason that satisfies us. Though there is this intelligibility constraint for Leibniz, as we've seen. Okay, so we persist with our own questions until we obtain a reason that satisfies us. And in all cases, we feel that we cannot force our mind to accept something without a sufficient reason. That is to say, without a reason that makes us understand why this thing is what it is, rather than something completely different. And again, I want to emphasize the us. Okay, so it's not just that if one were to understand the nature and the property, one could, conceivably, see how the property arises from the nature. That's not the sort of claim here. It's, a sufficient reason is the sort of reason that makes us understand why this thing is what it is. Okay. She characterizes a sufficient reason in terms of a reason that makes us understand, a reason that satisfies us, and a reason that makes it possible for an intelligent being to understand. And now on this control of sufficient reason, no sufficient reason can be inaccessible to us in principle. Moreover, it seems that for Du Châtelet, and unlike for Leibniz, a sufficient reason must meet a condition that involves indispensable reference to a finite mind or intelligence. A sufficient reason must be a reason accessible by us. So not just accessible, by some intelligence, but by us in particular. Now, like Leibniz's conception of sufficient reason, Du Châtelet's conception is closely related to her conception of a cause. So she writes here in section 10, this principle banishes from philosophy all the reasonings of the scholasticism, for the scholastics accepted that nothing happens without a cause, but they would allege as causes plastic natures, vegetative souls, and other meaningless words. But once it has been established that a cause is good only insofar as it satisfies the principle of sufficient reason, that is to say, insofar as it contains something making it possible to show how and why an effect can happen, then it substitute these grand words for ideas. Okay, and I just want to focus here on the sentence where she says a cause is good only insofar as it satisfies the principle of sufficient reason. That is to say, insofar as it contains something making it possible to show how and why an effect can happen. And so there is this tight connection here for Du Châtelet between what a sufficient reason is and what a cause is. And it seems that insofar as a sufficient reason is the sort of thing that makes us understand, a cause here, in a way, plays the same role for her. It's the sort of thing that, makes it possible. Yeah, sorry, insofar as it contains something that making it possible, the cause contains something that makes it possible to show how and why an effect can happen. Okay, though, so just because there is this tight connection, though, for her does not entail that sufficient reasons just are causes. So there isn't really an identity here necessarily. It's just that there is this tight connection, and I think this tight connection suggests that her epistemic constraint on sufficient reason extends to cause. So I think this suggests that for Du Châtelet, it is a constraint on what a cause is that it figure in a sufficient reason, a reason that makes it possible to show how and why an effect can happen. And it follows that if a sufficient reason for Du Châtelet must be such that it involves indispensable reference to a finite mind, the same must hold for a cause. What a cause is for her is likewise constrained by the cognitive reach of finite minds. But again, it would be too quick to conclude that sufficient reasons just are causes. But I just think that insofar as there is this epistemic constraint on sufficient reason, there's also an epistemic constraint on cause. However, I'm now going to just talk about Wolff for a bit and then come back to Du Châtelet. Wolff, like Du Châtelet and Leibniz, also endorses an epistemic constraint on sufficient reason and endorses a somewhat tight connection between sufficient reasons and causes. But for Wolff, I think the fact that there's this epistemic constraint on sufficient reason does not extend, it does not entail that there's likewise an epistemic constraint on what a cause is. So I'll give you my reading of Wolff here. Okay, so here I have a couple of passages here from the Ontologia, where Wolff writes, "Nothing is without a sufficient reason why it is rather than is not. That is, if something is posited to be, then something must also be posited, whence it is understood why it is rather than it is not." Okay, so that's just the epistemic constraint. We understand under sufficient reason that from which it is understood why anything is. So again, it's built into what a sufficient reason is, that it's the sort of thing that makes us understand. So far, so Wolff, there's like Du Châtelet and Leibniz, Wolff also seems to be endorsing this epistemic constraint. When something is present from which one can comprehend why something exists, that thing has a sufficient ground. Again. Okay. Okay, so what then is the connection for Wolff between a sufficient reason or ground and a cause? And what's interesting here is that the two for him are not identical. So here Wolff writes, if a thing A, and this is from his German metaphysics, if a thing A contains in itself something from which one can understand why side A, one calls that which is to be grounded in A the ground of B. A itself is called the cause, and one says of B that it is grounded in A. The ground is that by which one can understand why something is, and the cause is a thing that contains the ground of another in itself. And then Wolff goes on to give a few examples. And what I think is interesting here is that on Wolff's view, it seems that a ground is a feature or property of a cause. Okay, so I'll just read you this passage that's not on the handout. He writes, if I investigate how it happens that everything in a garden grows quickly and find that this is to be ascribed to the warmth of the air, warmth is the ground of the rapid growth, and the air, insofar as it is warm, is the cause. So the cause is air, the air, which is warm, and the ground is the warmth, which is a feature or property of the air. Yeah, and here's another example. Again, if I want to go outside because the weather is beautiful, the representation of the beautiful weather is the ground of my desire, and the soul, insofar as it makes this representation, is the cause. And again, here, the ground seems to be a feature of the cause. Sorry. I'll read it again. If I want to go outside because the weather is beautiful, the representation of the beautiful weather is the ground of my desire. And the soul, insofar as it makes this representation, is the cause of the desire. It's kind of a weird example, I think. Yeah, so it's a feature, at least as I'm reading this, it is a feature of this representation made by the soul that it represents the weather is beautiful. And that representation of the weather is beautiful is the ground. And then that is a feature of the representation as a whole, which is the cause. Yeah, I think the most clear example I find is like the air and the warmth of the air. Yeah. Okay, so these passages seem to suggest that on Wolff's view, a ground is a property of the cause. Now, suppose that a property F is a ground of an effect, the cause of the effect would then be the object insofar as it is F. This distinction between cause and ground opens up the possibility of there being an epistemic intelligibility constraint on ground, but not on cause. And so it is not obvious, at least not obvious on the basis of an epistemic constraint on ground, that Wolff endorses an epistemic constraint on cause or causal relations, insofar as they involve causes. And so in Wolff's case, I don't think that an epistemic constraint on causation, an epistemic constraint on causation does not entail, an epistemic constraint on sufficient reason does not entail an epistemic constraint on causation. That's what I need to say. Epistemic causal idealism is a stronger view that it is constitutive of cause that it be intelligible to us. But I think that by contrast, for Du Châtelet, there is this epistemic constraint on sufficient reason, and it extends to causes. So there's also this epistemic constraint on causes, and I think this makes her an epistemic causal idealist. Okay. All right, so here's my argument for why I think Du Châtelet is committed. You know, she might not have espoused it herself explicitly, but I think she's committed to an epistemic causal idealism. For this claim, it takes the following form. So I put it on the handout, premise conclusion form. So premise one, it is constitutive of what a sufficient reason is, that it enables us to acquire knowledge through causal reasoning. Premise two, we could not acquire knowledge through causal reasoning if sufficient reasons were in principle inaccessible. And so conclusion, it is constitutive of what a sufficient reason is, that it is in principle inaccessible. Okay. So why should we accept the first premise? Well, I think that it is constitutive of what a sufficient reason is for Du Châtelet, that it enables us to acquire knowledge through causal reasoning. So first, the PSR for her is a principle that secures knowledge rather than mere belief or justified belief. And I think she's very explicit about this. She's explicit that the PSR plays a crucial role as the foundational principle, of knowledge. And in fact, this is how it is first introduced in the foundations. It is under her discussion of the PSR. It's under her discussion of the principles of our knowledge, where she writes, the principle on which all contingent truths depend, and which is neither less fundamental nor less universal than that of contradiction, is the principle of sufficient reason. And again, it must be acknowledged that one could not have rendered the sciences a greater service, for the source of the majority of false reasoning is forgetting sufficient reason. And she also explicitly argues for our knowledge of God's existence in chapter 2 of the Foundations on the basis of the PSR. Okay, so again, I want to highlight that, she's not, the PSR is playing this crucial role for her in securing the foundation for knowledge. And this again connects with what Clara was discussing earlier. Okay. Why think that it is constitutive of sufficient reason that it enables us to acquire knowledge? So why that claim? And I think that it's constitutive of sufficient reason that it enables us to acquire knowledge for her, because it is a necessary feature of sufficient reason that it enables the acquisition of knowledge. And this necessity has no explanation other than it is constitutive of sufficient reason that it enables acquisition of knowledge. So I think it is necessary that sufficient reason enables this acquisition of knowledge, and it would be weird if it was just a brute necessity. And so I think the best explanation for this is that it is constitutive of sufficient reason for her that it enables us to acquire knowledge. So to see why it is necessary for Du Châtelet that a sufficient reason enables knowledge acquisition, suppose that this feature were a contingent or accidental feature. It would then be possible for a sufficient reason to be such that it does not enable the acquisition of knowledge. But then the PSR could not perform the theoretical role of securing the foundation for knowledge, which is, she's explicit that it does. And that is because if it is a contingent or accidental feature of the PSR that it enables us to acquire knowledge, it would be merely lucky that we get scientific knowledge through the PSR, for it could easily have been the case that the PSR does not deliver knowledge. Okay, this would just make knowledge delivered through the PSR really fragile. But this goes against Du Châtelet's claim that the PSR is a foundational principle of knowledge. Okay, it can't really be a foundational principle for knowledge if it could easily not do it. In other words. Okay. So again, if it is necessary, if it's a necessary feature of what a sufficient reason is, that it enables us to acquire knowledge. And there's no other explanation for why it should be a necessary feature. To draw is that it is constitutive of what a sufficient reason is. It enables us to acquire knowledge. Okay, all right, so that's the first premise. Why accept premise 2 of this argument that I've put on the handout? And the second premise is we could not acquire knowledge through causal reasoning if sufficient reasons were in principle inaccessible. And I think that claim, so my argument for that claim is based on what I think is a very original argument for the PSR that she gives in the foundations, that I'll talk about for a bit. And I don't think this argument, anything like this argument, is present in either Leibniz or Wolff. So we have this very original, distinctive argument for the PSR in the foundations. Okay. So, okay. So what is this argument? So Du Châtelet suggests in the institution, that without the PSR, we could not be certain that the world as we know it continues to exist after we cease to observe it. We cannot take for granted the stability of the world we experience. So, she writes, for example, I don't think this passage is on the handout. If we try to deny this great principle, this is section 8, we would fall into strange contradictions. For as soon as one accepts that something may happen without sufficient reason, one cannot be sure of anything. For example, that a thing is the same as it was the moment before, since this thing could change at any moment into another of a different kind. Thus, truths for us would exist only for an instant. Now, I think Du Châtelet's point here can perhaps be put as follows. Our judgment that something we observe has not changed at a later moment when we have ceased to observe it depends on the truth of the PSR, because absent the PSR, it will always remain epistemically possible that a state of affairs we observed at one time, say time t1, such as that my desk is in my office, is no longer the case, no matter what other evidence I acquire about potential causes and effects in the world. For example, evidence that no one has entered my office between time t1 and time t2 and attempted to remove the desk. So in other words, unless the PSR is true, there's always the epistemic possibility that things can happen for no reason at all. And this is a possibility that jeopardizes our ability to extend our knowledge by reasoning about causes or lack thereof and their possible effects. Now, Du Châtelet also claims that we need the PSR in order to make judgments about identity and difference. So in the same section, she writes, section 8 of the foundations, thus, for example, if I have a ball made out of stone and a ball of lead, and I'm able to put the one in place of the other in a basin of a pair of scales without the balance changing, I say that the weight of these balls is identical, that is the same, and that they are identical in terms of weight. If something could happen without a sufficient reason, I would be unable to state that the weight of the balls is identical at the very instant when I find that it is identical, since a change could happen in one and not the other for no reason at all. And so while in the first passage, her concern seems to be with judgments about sameness across time, whether things are the way I left them in my office, for example. In the second case, her concern seems to be with synchronic judgments, that is, judgments about identity and sameness and difference at a time. And her point seems to be that we cannot judge whether the two balls, the ball of stone and the ball of lead, weigh the same or not, unless the PSR is true. Absent the PSR, we could not infer that the balls weigh the same from the fact that one is able to put one ball in place of the other without the balance changing, for we could not rule out the possibility that a change might take place. For example, one side of the balance hangs lower or, fails to take place for no reason at all. So in particular, if the scales could fail, then we are not entitled to infer from their failure to move that the balls weigh the same. And so our judgments about sameness and difference on the basis of reasoning about causes and effects rely on the truth of the PSR. Now, in both these examples, the relevant sufficient reasons need not be accessible to us in principle. Sorry, need to be accessible to us in principle, not. And to see why, let us suppose that most sufficient reasons were inaccessible to us in principle, as Leibniz says. Now, suppose further that we cannot infer from the outset we cannot from the outset distinguish facts whose sufficient reasons we cannot know from facts whose sufficient reasons we can know. We could not then rely on the PSR in order to know that, for example, the two balls weighed the same. We may see, for example, that the scale does not hang lower on the one side than the other, but be unable to conclude that therefore one ball is not heavier than the other, for there may be a sufficient reason inaccessible to us, which explains why the scale does not hang lower on the one side than the other, even if the one ball weighs more than the other. And so our ability to reason about causes and effects in a way that yields knowledge, it does not depend merely on the PSR. So I think I take her to be giving arguments here for the PSR, but the sorts of arguments that she's giving here for the PSR are not just arguments for the PSR. They're arguments for the PSR and the claim that I can generally, if not always, know the sufficient reasons for truth. Okay. And again, you might think that more than like an in principle accessibility requirement is needed here to make, given the sort of justification she's giving for the truth of the PSR. And I think that's right. So that, for example, like it's not enough that sufficient reasons be in principle accessible. They also have to be in practice accessible most of the time for this kind of justification to make sense. But as far as I'm I just want to draw how I want to just highlight the way in which she really comes apart from Leibniz. And for that purpose, all I'm showing here for now is that she rejects this claim that Leibniz is committed to, that sufficient reasons, that a huge class of sufficient reasons, that a class of sufficient reasons is in principle inaccessible to us. So for her, sufficient reasons need to be in principle accessible. Okay. I also think that Du Châtelet lacks Leibniz's motivation for rejecting an epistemic causal idealism. Okay, so as I discussed earlier, Leibniz's view, sufficient reasons for contingent truths can be grasped a priori only by God, and this is a consequence of his concept containment theory of truth, along with the analysis of contingency in terms of this infinitely long demonstration. And unlike Leibniz, for Du Châtelet, the principle of contradiction is the foundation of all only necessary truths, which suggests that for her, contingent truths don't reduce to identity. So she rejects Leibniz's analysis of contingency here, which I think makes it possible for her to not then be committed to Leibniz's claim that sufficient reasons for contingent truths are in principle inaccessible. Okay, I'm almost done. We're probably running out of time. Okay, so again, going back to this claim that I'm attributing to Du Châtelet, that she's an epistemic causal idealist about natural reasons. So why restrict this to sort of natural causes? And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, divine reasons and causes are for Du Châtelet inaccessible to us. And she's explicit in the second chapter of the Foundations that we cannot understand things as God does. Okay, so she writes, the ideas that God has of things being infinitely distinct, they are infinitely different from ours, as would be more or less the idea that we have of the moon in relation to the one a man who had lived a long time on that planet would have of it. The way in which God sees and envisages all possible things is thus incomprehensible to us. Okay, so that's one reason. There are other places in the Foundations where she expresses a similar view. And second, the considerations which motivate my argument on Du Châtelet's behalf for her commitment to epistemic causal idealism just do not extend to God's reasons. And so so that's why the restriction to natural causes. Okay. And finally, let's ask this question. So why does it matter that Du Châtelet is an epistemic causal idealist? And I think this is a really interesting, if true, that she's committed to this, it's a really interesting conclusion for a couple of reasons. One, it highlights her scientific approach to metaphysics. Insofar as the investigation of causes falls within the purview of science, the possibility of science requires that causes are not placed outside of our reach. And this sort of idealism on her part highlights this. And secondly, I think Aaron might disagree with me here. It is not merely a contingent feature of this world that sufficient reasons and thus causes are intelligible to us. If it is constitutive of what a cause is, that it be intelligible to us, that it be graspable by us for her, then you can have a possible world where the world as it is does not hook up with our minds. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thanks.